The small town of Fernhill was peaceful, nestled in the shadow of the misty mountains and surrounded by dense woods. Most of the houses were old, built during the late 1800s, with creaking floorboards and thick wooden beams that whispered the secrets of their long histories. But none of them had a story quite as terrifying as the house on Elm Street. It was a Victorian-style house, standing alone at the end of the road, with tall, narrow windows that glared like eyes. For years, it had been abandoned, its once beautiful exterior crumbling under layers of dust and ivy. Yet, despite its eerie appearance, no one dared go near it, not since the legend of the Smile Girl at the window began. The legend was simple, yet terrifying. Locals whispered that late at night, if you passed the house and looked up at the second-floor window, you would see a young girl standing there, smiling. She would stare at you, her eyes following your every move, her smile growing wider and wider. And if you dared to smile back, well, no one had ever lived to tell what happened next. It was October, and the chill of autumn had just started to settle in. The trees lining Elm Street were shedding their fiery red and orange leaves, covering the ground in a crisp blanket. Jake, a high school senior, and his friends had heard the stories about the Smile Girl since they were kids. Most of them laughed it off, chalking it up to the town's need for some spooky folklore. But Jake was different. He had always been intrigued by the unknown, fascinated by the supernatural. So when his friends dared him to visit the house on Elm Street on Halloween night, he didn't hesitate. He accepted the challenge with a grin, eager to prove them wrong. "You're crazy, Jake," his best friend Sam said, shaking his head. "That house gives me the creeps. What if the stories are true?" "They're just stories," Jake replied confidently. "Come on, man. Don't tell me you actually believe in ghosts." Sam didn't answer, but the unease on his face was clear. Jake didn't care. He grabbed a flashlight and set off toward the house just as the clock struck midnight. The air was colder than Jake expected as he made his way down Elm Street. The wind howled through the trees, and the sound of crunching leaves under his feet seemed unnaturally loud in the silence of the night. When he reached the house, he paused for a moment, staring up at its decaying facade. The second-floor window was dark, the glass so old and dirty that it looked opaque. For a split second, Jake felt a flicker of doubt. What if there was something up there? What if the stories were real? Shaking off the thought, he took a deep breath and stepped toward the house. His flashlight beam danced across the peeling paint and overgrown vines. The door was unlocked, just as he'd expected. With a push, it creaked open, revealing a long, dark hallway. The smell of mildew hit him instantly, and the air inside was heavy with dust. Jake coughed and raised his flashlight, illuminating old furniture covered in sheets, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling like forgotten memories. He made his way through the house, exploring each room. It was unsettlingly quiet, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Finally, he reached the stairs leading to the second floor. As he climbed, the wood groaned under his weight, and a chill ran down his spine. When he reached the top, he found himself in a long hallway with several closed doors. At the end of the hallway was the door leading to the room with the window. Jake swallowed hard and walked toward it. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept going, determined to see the room for himself. The door was slightly ajar, and with a shaky hand, he pushed it open. The room was small, almost barren, except for a single bed pushed up against the wall and a large mirror opposite the window. Dust coated everything, and the air felt thicker here, oppressive. He stepped inside, his eyes immediately drawn to the window. There was no one there, just the dirty glass staring back at him, reflecting the pale moonlight from outside. Jake sighed in relief and chuckled to himself. "I knew it," he muttered, shaking his head. But just as he turned to leave, he heard something. A soft giggle, faint but unmistakable. He froze. Slowly, he turned back toward the window. Standing in front of it was a girl. She looked no older than 12, wearing a white dress stained with dirt, her long black hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. And she was smiling. Not a warm, friendly smile, but something much darker, much more sinister. Her lips stretched unnaturally wide, her teeth too white, too sharp. Jake stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. The girl's smile grew wider as she stared at him, her eyes glinting with something otherworldly. His breath caught in his throat, panic rising in his chest. Who are you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The girl didn't answer. She just continued to smile, her head tilting slightly to the side. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed at him. Jake's heart raced. He backed away toward the door, but his feet felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. The girl took a step forward, her smile widening, her eyes never leaving his. He tried to move, tried to scream, but he couldn't. It was as if the house itself had come alive, holding him in place, forcing him to stare at the grotesque smile that was now inches from his face. Suddenly, the girl lunged at him, her smile twisting into a terrifying snarl. Jake bolted out of the room, nearly tripping over his feet as he raced down the hallway. Behind him, he could hear her laughter, echoing through the house like a chorus of nightmares. He reached the front door and flung it open, stumbling out into the cold night. He didn't stop running until he was back on his street, panting, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might explode. He glanced back at the house on Elm Street, but the window was dark, and the girl was nowhere to be seen. Jake never spoke about what happened that night. Not to his friends, not to anyone. But from that day on, he avoided Elm Street, never daring to go near the house again. A week later, a new family moved into the house, unaware of its dark history. On the first night, the mother swore she saw a little girl standing at the window, smiling down at her as she walked past. She smiled back. The next morning, the house was empty again. No one ever saw the family again. And from that night forward, the legend of the smile girl at the window lived on, stronger than ever.